Good afternoon, dear listeners, viewers, commentators, everyone who watches the Vox Veritatis channel, the first historical Ukrainian video dialoguing. And today, in today's Saturday Historian, we have a professor of historical sciences, a dean of the Faculty of History of the University of Lviv, Mr. Ruslan Syromskyi. Good afternoon, Mr. Ruslan.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vitali. Good afternoon, dear listeners and viewers.
I shall tell the viewers where we met. We met at the final stage of the All-Ukrainian History Olympiad, and as far as I remember, we worked together several times.
Of course.
I especially remember our visit to the Mykolaiv Local History Museum. Do you remember that?
I remember the walk around the museum and the Mykolaiv embankment.
And I remember when a local tour guide told us that there was a good collection of Vereshchagin in the museum. If you want to see originals of Vereshchagin's works, visit the Mykolaiv Museum. After the war, of course, because of bombings, there was a picture in which the tour guide told us that the English soldiers left their soldier there, and the eagles were eating the soldier. And then, you were the only one who came up and read what Vereshchagin wrote there, and found out it was a Russian soldier. This was the best and most memorable story from my time at Mykolaiv Museum. A great story.
I almost forgot, but thank you for reminding me. I remember something like that.
There indeed was. So, Mr. Ruslan, where did you get your history education?
I received my degree in history at the University of Lviv. I graduated in 2002.
And since you are a doctor of historical sciences, you defended both the candidate and the doctor's thesis. So, what were the topics of these theses?
After graduation, I entered postgraduate studies, and after that I defended my candidate's thesis. I dealt with the problem of Canadian federalism and how Quebec issues influenced the evolution of the federal system in Canada, as such from 1960 to 1982. I researched the problems of federalism and separatism. As for the doctor's thesis, it was conducted on two subjects at once: history of Ukraine and the history of the world. The center of my attention was the violation of human rights in the then Ukrainian USSR, and also how Canada, its Ukrainian diaspora, and in the end, the authorities reacted to these violations as they tried to help Ukrainian dissidents. In this regard, the period from 1945 to 1991 is the declaration of the restoration of the Ukrainian state.
So, you started with world history, and then moved on to the history of Ukraine.
In a way.
I think viewers understand that the period of 1945-1991 is the period of the Cold War. Therefore, the first question I wanted to ask you, that is also related to school program, about the Cold War, about when and why it began. The question to you, as a specialist in this topic: how, when, and why did the Cold War begin?
The question is difficult, given that even after the declaration of Ukraine's independence, the restoration of the Ukrainian state since 1991, if we take into account Ukrainian history textbooks, sadly our authors have stubbornly written and repeated that the Cold War began with the speech of Winston Churchill in Fulton in March 1946, or with the declaration of Truman's Doctrine, the American president who in 1947 spoke before the Congress of the United States of America. There he suggested to provide assistance to Greece and Turkey so that the left-wing forces would not come to power in these countries. It is a pity that for a long time we had such a picture that the Cold War began with the hands of the British, Americans, and so on. In fact, it was not really like that. If we go to this issue in detail, if we analyze what happened at the final stage of World War II, we will see that the speech of Winston Churchill on March 5, 1946, was rather a reaction to the fact that the Cold War was already ongoing, let alone the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War as a phenomenon, this important period of human history, it makes more sense to say it began in 1945. The Second World War had a very quick transition to the Cold War. Why did this happen? It happened primarily because, first of all, in the years of the Second World War, there were already misunderstandings among the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. They were different about Iran, about Poland's future, and about Germany's future, and many other such inconsistencies, as we would call it, which were difficult to resolve. And as of the year 1945, these allies of the anti-Hitler coalition were not united in any way. Here, rather, the question arises that first and foremost, they were united by a single enemy, Hitler's Germany, a situational alliance. And when de facto Nazi Germany was dealt with, this situational alliance could no longer exist because there was no way to unite these countries. What could have united, for example, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Stalin? When Churchill, as soon as the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, called the Bolsheviks, the communists, a herd of wild baboons who had come to power and destroyed civilization. Or the phrase of Churchill, that he was ready to establish an alliance with Satan, with the devil, only to defeat Hitler. So Hitler was defeated. And the question of the alliance of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union was not relevant at that time. The alliance ceased to exist, and everyone was already thinking about their geopolitical interests. Some thought about the hegemony in the world, that is true. That's why 1945 put a stop to the anti-Hitler coalition, and in fact led the world into a new period of history, which we call the Cold War, when there was in fact a fierce standoff between the most diverse political and economic systems. It even affected sports and culture. There was also an armed standoff, but on the territory of third countries. That's why Cold War started in 1945. But what became the starting point of the Cold War? It is hard to say at what point exactly, at what day and hour, the Cold War began precisely. We cannot say that. It is not a hot war when first shot was fired or the border of a country was crossed. It is not easy to do. But most Western historians think that the Yalta Conference was the starting point of the Cold War. In February 1945, in the Lebedia Palace of Yalta, now occupied Yalta, the meeting of the leaders of the Great Triad took place. Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt attended it. The meeting was interesting because, notably, the Allies expressed disagreement on many issues, and that was reiterated in Potsdam. This combination of Yalta and Potsdam, the next meeting of the big trio, but already in the summer, late August 1945, these foundations of the Cold War were set up. When more and more issues appeared that divided rather than united the former Allies. Plus, there are other circumstances that we will obviously also discuss in today's conversation. And you should also understand that in 1945, at the time of the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt came in. Let's say, not in a very good condition. He had a transplant already. The meeting was in February, and soon after, in April, Roosevelt died. He was already sick enough at that time, and many issues were solved by his advisors instead. And later, as it will become known, some of his advisors were under the influence of the Soviet special services, starting with Alger Hiss, who is called the father of the United Nations organization, which is still well known today, where he laid the foundations of the UN vote, and the way he has promoted the idea of giving the Soviet Union the Kuril Islands to take them from Japan, and so on. Such pitfalls, problems took place at the Yalta Conference, for example. So in February 1945, in the summer of 1945, the principles of the Cold War were laid, and the Cold War begins. The Cold War begins.
And the reason, as I understood, are different economic and political systems of former allies of the anti-Hitler coalition.
Of course, these are ideologically different systems, different views on development, be it democratic or Stalinist. Well, not Stalinist, but the ideas of the Trotsky led Trotsky, world revolution. But Stalin did not refuse it. The world revolution idea will be in the program of the Soviet Communist Party. The Second World War was a great moment to promote this idea. They no longer spoke about it loudly. Yes, they stopped talking about it when in 1920 they got beaten at Warsaw. But they did not give up on this idea, and the events of 1945-1948, the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, this is also the idea of the world revolution, when country after country, countries after countries are affected by the influence of Moscow and communist regime. The salami tactic, so to speak, about advancing by little steps, reach a great distance.
When do you think the Cold War has ended? Can you give a specific date? Or is it also unclear, just like with its beginning?
Taking into account the events of today, we can even assume that the Cold War is still going on. We are living in its new stage. Researchers have also written about it. There were studies by Lucas, a British researcher. The new Cold War. He, however, dated it from the beginning of the 2000s, especially when the Russian Federation invaded Georgia in 2008, the Russian-Georgian War. It was then when they have started talking about a full-scale new Cold War. As for the Cold War itself, de jure, there are different dates that are being called the end of the Cold War. 1989, among others, when the Berlin Wall fell. It was a symbol of the Cold War that divided West and East Germany. At the same time, it was an ideological war between the West and the communist world. 1990 as well, when the German unification has finally happened. The Paris summit was held. The OSCE. They talked about the end of the Cold War. Lastly, 1991, when the Soviet Union has come to an end. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the Russian Federation began the process of gathering, rebirth, reincarnation of the Soviet Union. This is reminiscent of the events of 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed. The Russian Empire collapsed because of revolutionary events. But soon after, the former Russian Empire's lands were subject to conquest. Some lands were taken, some weren't, like Finland. It turned out too hard to conquer. That's why the Cold War ended after 1991. It even gave the Americans and British the reason to disband a part of the special services that worked in the East. Because we are no longer enemies. We no longer need this. But the events today show that the Cold War has not ended. It did not end because in the end, Moscow still exists. Moscow has reborn its own empire. The empire, we may call it a subpar empire, because they didn't manage to conquer Ukraine, but it is imperialism, which threatens the world order.
Understood. Thank you. The War of Spies. War of Intelligence was a part of the Cold War. If you can, please elaborate on that too, because as far as I understand, it was also a sphere of your professional interest.
Indeed, the Cold War is connected with the spy history. Spying is as old as the world. The Cold War ended up showing the best of the spy phenomena. And as we talked about when the Cold War began, we talked about 1945. We mentioned the Yalta Conference. We can also remember the events that unfolded later, in the summer of 1945, when in the Arctic camp in Crimea, Soviet children, pioneers, met the ambassadors of the United States of America and Great Britain. There was a meeting of two ambassadors with Soviet pioneers. Soviet pioneers gifted the American ambassador, Harriman, a wooden seal, a coat of arms of the United States of America, well painted and well cut, made of valuable materials. The American ambassador later has this coat of arms in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for a while, until the American intelligence services find a security camera in it. Then, at the meeting,
I apologize. Did they give anything to the British?
the British ambassador said, I envy you. I envy you so much. You received such a beauty, and we didn't get anything. But then it turned out that such gifts were given by the Soviet side to other embassies as well. So in fact, for several years, the Soviet special services have heard everything that was happening in the Embassy of the United States of America in Moscow. However, when the Americans found out, they decided to play these so-called games. The radio was still in its coat of arms, but for several years, they have been disinforming the Soviet side about certain events. That is, it was the summer of 1945. The war did not end formally. The war will end on September 2nd, 1945, and the Allies no longer trust each other with such intrigue. Why did I mention this? In particular, because children were used blindly. They were used like that at that time. But when we talk about the Cold War and the spy operations, perhaps, the key event was the Igor Guzenko's case. On September 2nd, 1945, the Second World War ended with the signing of the Act of Capitulation of Japan. And on September 5th, the head of the encryption service of the Central Intelligence Agency of the Soviet Union in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, will appear in the Department of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He made a statement that he is a Lieutenant Igor Guzenko, who worked as an encryption officer, and he has more than 100 documents that testify that the Soviet Union has a spy network in the states of the West. Quite interestingly, Igor Guzenko was not believed by the police. They said that Canada, the United States, the Soviet Union are allies, and that guy is here to spout nonsense. They did not believe. With these documents, Igor Guzenko went to the editorial office of the Ottawa Journal, but the journalists did not believe him there either. They said that it was not worth our attention, and that we were allies, and we just won. We wouldn't like any argument. Not interested. And when Guzenko returns back home, he asks his neighbor, a former Canadian Armed Forces veteran, for shelter. He is afraid to stay in his apartment. He and his wife stay in the neighbor's apartment. They become witnesses to the door of his apartment being broken at night. 4 people appear who he recognizes as the employees of the Soviet embassy. The neighbor calls the police. Only then it becomes clear that Igor Guzenko is in danger, and he is interested in him. And then the cipherman then gives over 100 documents that show that the Soviet Union is working very actively, especially since 1943, on the formation of an extensive spy network. What becomes clear? First, the communist parties in Western countries were completely under the control of Moscow. They are financed by Moscow. They receive tasks, what they have to do. For example, the Communist Party of Canada was legally a corporation. They were paid money, they were told what they had to do, and so on. Secondly, it turns out that the Soviet Union has been building spy networks throughout Western Europe and North America. And it doesn't matter if it's Switzerland, the United States of America, or Canada. Why was Canada interesting for the Soviet Union? In particular, because there was a plant in Canada which was enriching uranium, which was later used for nuclear industry in the United States. The three United Union of the United States, Canada, and Great Britain were the core developers of the nuclear bomb. It was not so easy to work in the United States. The Soviet Special Services decided to operate through Canada. It was easier, so to speak, less attention. Their counterintelligence was more lenient. But there was a lot of information. After all, there are also art films about it. Red Joan, for example, the film about the events of 1945. The case of Guzenko then gains momentum. For Canadians who share information with the British and Americans, it becomes clear that they are allies. And what is being done? They steal information. It turns out that they photograph not only our military enterprises, but also the information about the location of military depots, military units, and so on. As a result of the investigation, which lasted more than a year, a number of arrests were carried out. It turned out that members of the Communist Party of Canada and other countries were involved in spy networks, formed spy networks. Some were arrested, some were able to run away. But as a result of these investigations, arrests, the Soviet spy network was calmed for a while. As one of its founders, I think, Mikhail Mandelstam recalls, it was one of the biggest failures of Soviet intelligence. Moreover, Soviet intelligence itself, the Soviet special services, took several lessons. Lesson 1. Why did Igor Guzenko manage to escape so easily? Well, the first thing was that he deciphered information about himself. Moscow wanted to call him back because they saw a certain disloyalty in him. And here, when you decipher information about yourself, that they want to call you back. And what your fate will be there. While here, it's not bad. It's great to live here. And his wife also says, well, why would we go there? We can stay here. And also his wife is pregnant. In addition, they already had a small child. And usually the employees of the embassy lived on the territory of the embassy. But the child of Guzenko family, Igor and Svetlana Guzenko, constantly cried, did not let the neighbors sleep, his superiors. That's why his manager allowed us to rent an apartment outside the embassy. It is allowed to escape easily, relatively easily. Well, Guzenko's case ends with the fact that relations between Canada and the Soviet Union worsen a lot. Ambassadors from the both sides are then called off. Prime Minister of Canada Mackenzie King will not be congratulated on his birthday jubilee. Relations will be quite tense. And when we bring up, we remember Winston Churchill on March 5, 1946, and his speech in Fulton. We can assume that Winston already had information at that time about this Guzenko, what was happening, and that the spy network that was deployed in the West frightened him because Canada shared information with Britain. It was natural, as well as with the United States of America. Therefore, those suspicions that were regarding the position of the Soviet Union in the military world, they were completely true. It can also be said about the so-called Maysky's Note of 1944. where he describes what and where the Soviet Union should advance. Further, the Guzenko case in the spy network. And further, such a fact dot in this story. And in the beginning of the Cold War as well, it is the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Because in Yalta, in February 1945, there was a clear declaration about the liberated Europe, where it was said that the victorious countries could support the democratization of those liberated countries. But how to support the democratization? It was about free elections, but in fact, Stalin spat on free elections. There were no free elections. It was the opposite. The left political forces were pushed through, the pro-Moscow political forces, not always even the communist, because not all countries even had more or less formidable communist parties. But they were so soon, in fact, formed as such. That's why this idea of a liberated Europe and the democratization of Europe has been completely failed. Why was it failed? Well, because the Red Army, the Soviet Army, is on the territory of the so-called liberated countries. Liberated countries. But in fact, one occupation changes another occupation. That's it. Nazi camps sometimes are transformed into Soviet camps, like the Jaworzno camp, a bright example. And therefore the Cold War and the spying at the beginning, they were very closely connected. And once again, if you go back to those spying adventures post-war, then the main goal of Soviet spyware was to get blueprints. And perhaps not only blueprints, but also materials. There was talk about enriched uranium and about the so-called heavy water, which was washed in order to get their own nuclear weapon. Because, as the witnesses of the events of the meeting in Potsdam in July in 1945 recall, when the President of the United States of America, Harry Truman, was informed that the babies were born safely, and he began to share information, partly. When he was sharing that, witnesses say that Stalin was not interested in this at all. People were talking about some kind of radical change, and Stalin did not care. This, in fact, gives reason to assume that Stalin was not just aware. He kept the situation on his pulse, and Lavrenti Beria, in fact, led this project of receiving confidential information on the development of nuclear weapons. And in a strange coincidence, obviously, not that actually strange, the first atomic bomb that the Soviet Union tested will be surprisingly similar to one of those bombs that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so-called the Fat Man bomb. That is very similar in terms of the blueprints and even close in weight. Therefore, the first stage of the Cold War would be related to the nuclear spy first and foremost. And in fact, we have already said that several people were jailed because of Guzenko's case, and a number of investigations began. And then on those who were investigated in Guzenko's case, but didn't have enough evidence to be imprisoned, there are the Rosenberg couple, who were later in the mid-50s executed, and these are the first spies who were executed. Later, the idea of executing spies will be rejected. They were rather kept for exchange after that, because spying is a matter, so to speak, bilateral. It is a move of both sides, some more, some less, but in the end, both sides did it.
Mr. Ruslan, about that Guzenko, they wanted to call him back, so that likely means that, from the point of view of the Soviet intelligence, he had some issues. Why did they want to do that?
The question is not even about his issues, but the fact that employees of this level each worked for brief periods of time and are often rotated. They could be transferred from one country to another. Special commissions came to talk, to try to find out the situation of this person. Probably during such a check, he could say something that alerted those who were checking. According to the memories of one of those who was in this commission, the issue was not Igor Guzenko per se, but his wife Svetlana, who was born in Donbass, if I remember correctly. Igor Guzenko himself was born in the territory of present-day Belarus, but given the surname, he could have had Ukrainian roots. Later on, when Guzenko will ultimately stay in Canada, he will be given political support. He will even say that he is of Ukrainian origin. He did not know Ukrainian, but he said that his family was Ukrainian. Obviously, Guzenko did not go through that check, so they wanted to call him back. And the mistake, as I said, was that he deciphered the encrypted message that was related to his future. Canadian Special Services, in cooperation with the Americans, gave him shelter. Changed his surname. His children also. He had many children. It was a large family. Everyone had changed their names. And interestingly, the Soviets haven't ever found him. Usually, in the Soviet Special Services, if you are a traitor, Guzenko is still referred to as such. You can read how the former KGB officers are complaining about him, that he is a traitor to the motherland, and so on. He was to be punished. Usually it happens. Since the 1950s, up to Litvinenko in Britain, or some other cases, Guzenko, surprisingly, was not found. Although in the Soviet Union, he was sentenced to death in absentia. Guzenko even appeared on television, although he appeared with a closed face. He had a special white cap. And because of this, he was given the nickname Catman. He came and gave an interview. Later, he also wrote a book, a memoir. It will be called This Was My Choice, where he will be denying that he and his wife stayed in Canada because of material well-being or whatnot. He also wrote a novel titled The Fall of a Titan, but this was not dedicated to Stalin, but to Gorky, Maxim Gorky. In that book, he is criticizing Gorky a lot. In the 1950s, 1960s, at the beginning of the 1960s, he still was appearing on the television, on interviews, but later he fell into obscurity because other interesting people appeared later. Well, and some say that later Igor Guzenko used alcohol a little, that it had a bad impact on his health, but he really made such a revolutionary change. And this step was what he really showed the extensive Soviet spy network in the West. West suspected its existence, but had no evidence, and now the evidence has appeared. In 1945,
Did you tell that they had some questions for his wife? Because she is from Donetsk region, from Ukraine.
it's not only her Ukrainian heritage. They believe that his wife wanted them to stay in Canada. Life, you could say, liked living there, so to speak. Meetings, parties, shops, bright lighting. He didn't want to return to the Soviet Union, to the poverty. Basically, she insisted on staying. This is one of the versions the Soviet side insisted upon. It was not a conscious move of Igor Guzenko. It was the role of his wife, Vyacheslav.
Understood. Thank you. Canada is also interesting because of the fact that it has the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the Western world. How did the Soviet side, led by the KGB, try to weaken the Ukrainians abroad?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, Canada has one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas, 1 million people, Ukrainian diaspora, which especially grew after the Second World War as a result of the next wave of immigration. This wave was important because during the first and part of the second wave, ordinary workers were going in search of land and income. This post-war wave of immigrants was a political wave of immigrants. These were educated people. You can remember Leonid Bilecki, Yaroslav Rudnitsky, and many others. These were former division members, veterans of the Waffen SS Galicia division. Canada gave them shelter. These were many people who understood that they were not on the good terms with the Bolshevik regime, and so they flee across the ocean. To conclude, the Ukrainian diaspora strengthened after World War II. If we were to read documents and excerpts of the KGB reports, the secret police visiting from across the ocean, they conclude that ever since late 1950s, the center of Ukrainian immigration has shifted from Europe, Western Europe in particular, shifted to North America, Canada, and the United States of America, where there were powerful Ukrainian communities united. Well, to an extent, they were disunited. Let's be frank here. If we talk about the Ukrainian diaspora, there were the Nanikites, Banderites, UVR followers, UNR, Petliorites, and others. That is, they were disunited, but when it came to the situation in Ukraine, the resistance to the Moscow communist regime, it was a common ground for unification. And very often those arguments were forgotten, and this alerted the Soviet side to Moscow. And from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, entire measures were taken to achieve what was called in the KGB a dissolution. The term dissolution is very broad. If you look at the Soviet counterintelligence dictionary, it has several stages that describe what should happen. This is, so to speak, official and unofficial measures. They differ depending on the situation. But in any case, it was about the fact that the united Ukrainian community is a threat to the Soviet Union, because there are not many so-called progressives. The Soviet side puts great emphasis on them, but they are ineffective. They constantly need money, but the effect from them is not much. Moreover, they allow themselves to criticize the Soviet system. That is, it is not suitable for them. So it is necessary to dissolve them, this large part of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian community, to solve that issue somehow. In 1962, in secrecy, a publication, a document by Colonel Boris Shulchenko appeared. He was at that time the deputy head of the KGB in the USSR. The document, in fact, reveals the stages of the dissolution of the Ukrainian diaspora, not only about Canada and the United States of America, but in general. That is what steps should be taken. Again, another term. We shall use the term that KGB members constantly used. In the end, this term has not disappeared yet. These are the so-called active measures. They adhere to active measures to dissolve the Ukrainian diaspora. What should be taken into account? First, this is the formation of the Soviet vision of certain events, both events of the past and events of today. Second, attempts to make the leaders of the Ukrainian community quarrel. Various tricks were used for this, as in supposedly someone stole money, some collection, but in fact that didn't happen. Or, for example, the head of the Committee of the Ukrainian People of Canada, Reverend Wasil Kushner, said or did something he shouldn't have, characterized someone wrong. Many examples, essentially attempts to discredit, quarrel, and smear this idea. That is, it was about the fact that there is defamation that can be absolutely untrue, a total lie. Then the truth is revealed that the relations remain worsened. This was the second moment. Third, infiltration of the environment of the Ukrainians by own agents. Unfortunately, Today we cannot establish every single agent who acted in the Ukrainian diaspora, but by the pseudonyms that go through the documents, somewhere you can even guess. Somewhere some were already known of those agents, but they were usually encrypted, like Nina Nike 4 or something like that. Such people were promoted. Moreover, these people, Soviet agents, they managed to reach quite influential positions in the Committee of the Ukrainians in Canada, or if we talk about the Congress Committee of the Americans, Ukrainians in America, that is, these people were promoted. They had serious opportunities, support. They did not always shine, so to speak, but from time to time, they tried to start quarrels among Ukrainians. Or say, what are we fighting for? There is Ukrainian SSR already, an actual state. They are represented in the United Nations. What do we want there? Let's engage in cultural exchange, support them. They worked in this way, and many other ways, really. KGB worked with the help of the embassies in those countries as well, for example, be it Canada or the United States of America, because the embassy was very often a cover for many agents who used to work in a way that was necessary for Moscow at any given time. Examples? Perhaps let's pick the most recent example about how they worked. In the 1980s, early 1980s, the Ukrainian community in Canada and the United States of America were going to honor the victims of Holodomor in 1932 to 1933. There were also measures to collect documentary material about the man-made famine of 1932 to 1933, including the involvement of American and Canadian parliamentarians and senators. They shot the film Harvest of Despair and installed a monument, first in Edmonton and then in other places. Many measures were taken. In Canada, the Soviet ambassador who worked there at that time was Alexander Yakovlev, who was known to us as the architect of the Gorbachev's perestroika. There are still stereotypes about him being a liberal, Gorbachev's right hand. When Gorbachev arrived in 1983 as the Minister of Agriculture to Canada, he became friends with Yakovlev, and when he became a General Secretary, he insisted on returning Yakovlev back home. Yakovlev was a historian. He found himself in Canada, supposedly because he was almost expelled from the Soviet Union. He wrote an article in a literary newspaper, which was not clearly treated by the leadership of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Therefore, Yakovlev was sent to Canada. What should we understand? People aren't being just expelled to the West. They could send him to some small African country. My apologies for African countries, but they would not expel him to big countries such as Canada or Australia.
It was probably a cover for him.
It was more of a cover for him. Even if we skip to when Yakovlev appeared in the Soviet Union and was the architect of the reconstruction, as he is called, he will criticize the Soviet political repression. But you will not find criticism of the Holodomor. You will not say anything about the famine of 1932 to 1933. There is nothing like that. You can read his memoirs. They are available. So Yakovlev makes a request to Moscow, prepares materials, tries to change the focus. To change the focus. What was the change in the focus? When the preparation for the honoring the 50th anniversary of the tragedy began in 1981 in Kiev, the accent was made on the celebration of the 1500th anniversary of the founding of Kiev.
It was Tolotko, I think, who invented that date.
Yes, they came up with this date.
Together with Tronco, I remember.
Basically, you are talking about a famine, a great famine, and we are talking about the splendor of Kiev, and so on. And Yakovlev will be among those people who will deny the famine. They will come out from the point of view that it was a tragedy. That on the contrary, we need to talk about the achievements of collectivization. There will be a press release. The embassy will create a press release, which will be published in all the universities of Canada. Every parliamentarian will be told that there was no famine, that some did not eat enough, but there was bad harvest. But you can also see that in Kazakhstan it was the same, and in other territories it was the same. That is the embassy in Yakovlev. There was also Radionov, who took his position later. That person also did not really empathize with the Ukrainians either. And Levko Lukyanenko, the first ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, writes about him quite clearly in his memoirs. That is, in this way, they tried to change the focus, to change the attention, or they shot the film Harvest of Despair. In fact, in the film, there were a few mistakes, either technical or some other nature. But these mistakes were clinged upon, and they began to portray the events as a fake. And when they found out that the film was partially sponsored by the government of Canada, that's it. What do Canadians finance? They were called Nazis, fascists, they were called criminals too. Canada gave refuge to fascists, Ukrainian fascists, and now they get support. And then Brian Mulroney was on the political scene, who was in the pre-election campaign in Canada, and the Conservatives tried to return to power. It was a certain breakpoint for the Soviet embassy, for Moscow. What a disaster. The leading Canadian political leaders support Ukrainian fascists. They called them that. And there are many such examples that could be brought up. Those came up during the entire era in question.
The Soviet Ukrainians received the celebration of 1500 years of Kiev in 1982. This was a response to the North American preparation for the year of the famine.
Yes.
Yes, and it is known that the Soviet Union and modern Russia are two countries where human rights were and still are constantly violated. How did the Ukrainian diaspora react to these violations of human rights in Soviet Ukraine?
Thank you. The question of human rights was very important for Canadians. It was laid down as the cornerstone of Canada's foreign policy. Especially clearly it could be seen in the 1970s. In the 1960s, people were more concerned about the rights of nations, about liberation. And we can recall the speech of the Prime Minister of Canada, John Diefenbaker, at the General Assembly of the United Nations in October 1961. Diefenbaker entered into a controversy with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. He said to him that you are talking about decolonization, about the liberation of the peoples of Africa. First, liberate Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, those four were talked about. Then you can talk about Africa or Asian countries. It is believed that the speech of Diefenbaker incredibly angered Khrushchev. He could not resist, he barely held himself together. But this was the policy of Canada and its leading actors. The Conservatives spoke more openly about the Ukrainian problems, because the Conservatives, at least before the declaration of independence of Ukraine, mostly won in the western provinces, where there were many Ukrainians. That is, their electorate was the expatriates of Eastern Europe, and there were not only Ukrainians, but also Poles, who were dissatisfied with the communism. Canada gave shelter to several dozen thousand Hungarians after 1956. It is obvious that there was no great love for Moscow and communism. There were also Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and many other peoples who were definitely not fond of the communism of the Soviet government. The conservatives spoke more openly about such things from Ukrainian positions. I mentioned John Diefenbaker, and we can also mention Gerald Clark. He was a conservative politician, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, and for a short time, the Prime Minister of Canada, who in the 1980s demanded the release of many Ukrainian dissidents. And there was also such a person called Danilo Shumok, for example, who comes to mind, or some others. And he also managed, during the Gorbachev's perestroika period, managed to free some of them and give them political shelter in Canada. As for the Liberals were more careful. In this regard, the Ukrainian issue, they were blamed a lot for that, especially when we talk about two of the brightest figures of Canadian politics, Lester Pearson and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. They were really more careful. Lester Pearson is a historian and diplomat. In 1955, he visited the Soviet Union for the first time. He visited Crimea. That was 1955, 10 years after the case of Igor Guzenko, which we have just mentioned. It became a little warmer between the Soviet Union and Canada after this visit. Until then, for 10 years, they were at a very low level. Pearson traditionally appeared at various Ukrainian rallies, supported them. But as a diplomat, he tried to not express himself in such public events, very anti-Soviet. Trudeau had the image of a Sovietophile for a while. The Americans, even the CIA, took action on him because of his connections with Fidel Castro, because they communicated and so on. But Trudeau, at the end of the day, also took a very clear position. He was really impressed by the fact that in 1971, before Trudeau visited Kiev, it was one of the episodes of his visit to the Soviet Union. He visited Kiev and was asked why Trudeau never mentioned Ukrainian dissidents. Although despite that, he had other positive moments. For example, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive, I had a handwritten transcript of Trudeau's speech at a meeting with the Ukrainian delegation. He himself emphasized it, but he clearly said that he was raising the flag for the Ukrainian people. Not Soviet, but Ukrainian people. There were definitely pro-Ukraine statements, but it's a fact that he did not stand up for the dissidents, and he was blamed for it, the same as he was blamed for not doing anything to free historian Valentin Moroz. In Canada, the question of Valentin Moroz was very popular in the 70s. Everyone talked about him, and some of the politicians scored extra publicity points by defending this dissident publicly, while Trudeau did not react, so to speak. And he was blamed for that, but at any rate, he provided support to the Ukrainian community. The Ukrainian community met non-stop with many politicians. Liberals as well actively took part in the international arena in the protection of Ukrainian political prisoners, Ukrainian dissidents. And this is also their role, their achievement, a great one. If we talk about some specific events, how the Ukrainian diaspora tried to draw attention to the situation in Ukraine, well, a few moments can be mentioned, a few cases. For example, in 1967 in Montreal, there was a big exhibition, Expo 67. This is a worldwide exhibition where each country demonstrated its achievements. Ukrainians always spoke from the point of view that any big event should be used to draw attention to our problems. And the Expo 67 in Montreal became such an event when Ukrainians tried to appear with blue and yellow flags. They printed leaflets. They even printed a fake leaflet. They came up with that leaflet attributed to Polyansky. If I'm not mistaken, he was born in Ukraine. Yes, but a Soviet official, a Ukrainian Soviet official, addresses that Moscow is oppressing Ukrainians. We have one Soviet Union, but we are oppressed. Well, it was a fake, and they removed it, of course. But in any way, Ukrainians tried to draw attention to the situation with human rights and the rights of the Republic. This was also very important. At the Expo, there was such a careless speech of the Prime Minister of Quebec, Daniel Johnson, who said that we would like to have the same rights as the Ukrainian USSR. He said that the Ukrainian USSR is a member of the EU, and Quebec is not a member of the UN and is part of the Federation. But he was quickly, as you can say, he was given a lot of arguments. Why, God forbid, Quebec should be the Ukrainian USSR? What would it lead to? Daniel Johnson changed his mind, as they say, for the Summer Olympics in Montreal in 1976. When Ukrainians got the Ukrainian flag, and the Ukrainian flag was hung on the flagpole in front of the Olympic Stadium, or at the football match of the German Democratic Republic and the Soviet Union. Daniel, my house, a member, ran out with the Ukrainian flag and danced the Hopak. And many such small moments, but they drew attention to the Ukrainian matter, to the Ukrainian situation, and the situation with human rights. And specifically, human rights were dealt with within the framework of the Committee of the Ukrainians of Canada and the World Congress of Free Ukrainians, a commission on human rights. This commission was led by Pavlo Yuzik, the senator of Ukrainian origin. Yuzik, his parents are from Lviv region, from the Chervonohrad area. Then Pavlo Yuzik was a very significant politician. He took part in various conferences, and within the framework of the UN, NATO represented Canada, and he was the head of the Human Rights Commission of the World Congress of Free Ukrainians. Another activist, very active, in particular in the context of the protection of the rights of Ukrainian women, dissidents. This is Kristina Isaev, who did a lot of useful things to draw attention to the human rights situation in then Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Ruslan. I would like to remind our viewers that you have been interested in the question about Valentin Moroz, a Ukrainian dissident. Dear viewers, there is also a program in the series Saturday Historian with Bogdan Paska, a candidate for the historical sciences, that is dedicated to the biography of Valentin Moroz. I and Mr. Ruslan know Mr. Bogdan very well, who won the Olympics from 6th to 11th grade. He was an absolute champion, and now he is a professional historian. Thank you very much, Mr. Ruslan, for your detailed answers. I think our viewers will like this program, and considering the positive feedback, I think we will meet again, because the topic of international relations is relevant today, and the topic of espionage is interesting and relevant at any time, as far as I understand.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the viewers for listening and watching.
It was very interesting. If possible, one more question. This conflict in the Canadian Parliament when there was a President Zelensky, and a conflict related to the Galicia division soldier. How would you evaluate this situation? Maybe some details.
Oh, the matter is actually much deeper than just that. The matter of Hunka, I think that was his surname, is the top of the iceberg. The issue of division officers in Canada has been discussed for a long time. We can even talk about the so-called operation of the KGB, payback. In the 1980s, it was carried out in the USA and Canada. It was directed against former Galicia division soldiers.
It is related to the Deschenies Commission, right?
Yes, the Deschenies Commission was created by the Supreme Court of Canada and Quebec. And about the Deschenies Commission, we could even make a separate video, talk about it.
And we will.
It was very resonant, really. What Soviet Union did, and how the Canadians and the Ukrainian diaspora acted. This was yet another moment that forced the Ukrainians to unite. They understood that they tried to destabilize them as much as possible, and to create some kind of precedent to show that Ukrainians are Nazis, Hitler's accomplices, and so on. This is a very sensitive issue, always. The issue of Hunka, I don't understand it. We don't know why he was invited. Was it because of the carelessness or not? Going back to the Deschenies Commission, the conclusion was clear. They were not criminals. Yes, they fought alongside the Third Reich. They were Hitler's allies, but they had no choice. When we read the conclusions of the Deschenies Commission, they fought against one tyrant alongside another tyrant. This was the conclusion of the Deschenies Commission. Yes, the Galicia division were allies of Hitler, but we need to understand the whole story. The invitation of Hunko was a very careless move. I have the impression that someone did it to stir disagreement between the Canadians and Ukrainians. I don't know if it was necessary, how justified it was. For me, it's a very strange thing. It's hard for me to comment because it seems to me that we, Mr. Vitali, don't know much about why it happened.
And what? And who is behind it? Thanks. I think we will make a video about the commission if you are not against it. This topic is really interesting and relevant for today's meeting. Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you for such detailed answers.